You're listening to WCAT Radio, your home for authentic Catholic programming.
Well, hi, and welcome to another episode of the Examine Life with Phil. I'm Phil, and this is my attempt to examine my life and encourage you to examine yours as well. I'm starting a new thing here, and hopefully leading up to the election, that I'm going to call practical political philosophy. And the idea I've got here is that very, very often people who like to talk about politics a lot are very, for lack of a better term, ungrounded in philosophy and end up saying a lot of very stupid and obviously fallacious things. Now, conversely with that, if you go read political philosophy, which I do highly recommend you do, but it doesn't tend to do a lot of spelling out of the practicality of it as to, well, this is the theory behind why this type of government should be and why it should work, and this is the theory behind why this other type of government should be and why it should work. Here's how the two theories conflict, and so on and so forth. But it doesn't tend to spell out what you should do as far as what type of politics you should pursue or not pursue, who you should vote for, if you should even be in favor of voting, and things along those lines. So the idea I had a while back that I'm pursuing now is, leading up to the election, I'm going to talk to somebody who comes at things from a conservative perspective, somebody who comes at things from a leftist or political left perspective, or supports the Democrats, something along those lines, and I'm going to try to talk to an independent or a libertarian type of person, and I'm going to try to get them to all give me the philosophy behind their politics. That is, what do they think the government should do and why, and how do they justify that? And then in turn, I'm going to ask them, now how are you applying that all to what's going on in our government and politics today? Why are you going to be supporting Trump, Biden, or someone else? Why are you not going to be supporting them? What's your justification for doing so? How do you answer for the faults and problems that supporting this person or not supporting this person comes up with? And basically try to take the theory, the philosophy, and make them apply it practically. So I think this should be great fun. Now, I already did the first part of this. Pat Flynn and I talked about these matters for 2 whole days. Well, not literally all day, 2 days. We did it over the course of 2 days. And that was on Monday and Tuesday of this week, so that was the 28th and the 29th of September. Now I'm recording this opening here on the night of October the 2nd, and this week was eventful even since we recorded that. Now, Pat did throw me for a little bit of a loop because I thought he was going to end up in the Libertarian camp, but he described himself as a Common Good Conservative, but that works fine. He can fill that perspective, and I'm going to find somebody else for the Libertarian perspective. I'm talking with somebody about that now. So I recorded an intro with Pat on this, but I'm going to actually edit that out and put this one in because it seems that since so much has happened since Monday and Tuesday this week, it cries out for me to record a little bit about this, and so much has happened in the world of politics. If I'm going to put out a podcast on politics, I think I need to say something about it. So lots of people have been talking about that absolutely disastrous debate between Trump and Biden on the 29th, and there's a lot of different criticisms people can make, different analysis, but a point that's occurred to me that I haven't heard anybody talk about is how presidential debates are not really debates, not in any meaningful sense anyway. They're not a clash of ideas or concepts. They're not really either party trying to prove anything other than maybe I should be president and he shouldn't. And a large part of the problem with that is their format is absolutely terrible for presenting any kind of coherent idea. Part of being president of the U.S. is that you're dealing with problems that are complicated, difficult, and, for the most part, not solved easily. That's part of what comes with the job of being president. The easy questions, the easy problems are solved and answered by people well below your station if you're president. So in these debates, what they do is they say, Mr. Trump or Mr. Biden, what is your economic plan for getting everything back on track? You've got 2 minutes if your opponent doesn't interrupt you. Well, that's ridiculous. You can't spell out something that complicated in 2 minutes. Even if you've got a good plan, there's no way you can explain it in 2 minutes. If you think you can explain something like that in 2 minutes, you're either God or you're an idiot. And God has never run for president, so you can see what I mean there. So the real critique I'd want to offer there is presidential debates are not debates. The whole format, the way it's geared, it's a detriment to actually getting any kind of ideas, issues, or possible solutions out in the public arena and debated with any sense of honesty. A better debate would be like the Lincoln-Douglas format. And the debate I did with David Van Beber on Inerrancy earlier this last year, that the format we used for that was based on the Lincoln-Douglas debate. And there were some other problems that went on there, but the format was very, very conducive to discussion and engaging of ideas. And so if we actually want presidential debates to be real debates and be meaningful and not be the absolute garbage that was what was between Trump and Biden, one way to do that would be to change the format and say, give somebody 10 or 15 minutes to lay out their case. Give the other opponent 10 or 15 minutes to lay out his case. Give them both rebuttals. Let there be some cross-answer time. Let a moderator ask some questions. But give them more than 30, 45 seconds, a minute, maybe 2 minutes to respond, because the problems that are facing our country that the government is seeking to solve are very, very complicated, and anybody who says they can answer them in 30 seconds, 45 seconds, or 2 minutes is just an idiot or flat-out lying. Okay, so the other really big development that happened late last night and this morning is that President Trump has now been diagnosed with COVID and is now at Walter Reed Hospital. And the administration has said it's mostly precautionary, although I and several other people I know are somewhat skeptical that they would actually move him to go through the effort and process of moving him to Walter Reed if there wasn't some sign that this needs to be taken seriously. So that is concerning, and should all be gentlemen and ladies about this and be classy and wish President Trump and his wife and everyone else who's infected with the virus a speedy recovery and keep them in our prayers. Okay, so all that done, I'm going to just drop you right into the first part of the discussion Pat Flynn and I had on why he takes a conservative position in politics and why he thinks you should support President Trump. And this will be the first part of our discussion, and I'll put out the next part next week. So first up, I asked Pat Flynn, who I've talked to a couple times before, to come back and talk to me about what should independents or maybe libertarians do in regards to politics and things like that, because we don't seem to fit into either of the camps very easily. So how are you doing today, Pat?
I am great, Phil. It's always a joy to chat with you. It's been too long. I feel like it's been over a year since our last conversation.
I think it has, yeah, and that is too long.
Indeed, yeah. And last time I believe we talked about libertarianism as well, so this is a fitting sequel.
Exactly. That's why I thought of you. I know you said at the time that you were thinking of like leaving some of the libertarian aspects of the philosophy of it behind, but I had a feeling even if you did that, at the least you'd still be sympathetic to that viewpoint.
Right, yeah. So just to give people a little brief history of my, I guess, political philosophy, I was always very politically interested. Even as a teenager, I was definitely more on the liberal side. And then I started to, there were just certain issues, even when I was young on the liberal side, that didn't seem right to me. And that's when I sort of encountered, Ron Paul, right, as many young, people, at least for my age, I don't know what age bracket you're in, Phil, but I'm a millennial. Ron Paul was kind of making some waves when I was in high school going into college. So I'm like, let me check this dude out. Picked up End the Fed and a couple of his other books, and really struck me. I had a lot of economic interests at the time as well, and my undergrad was actually in economics. So Mises, Hayek, those guys. So it's funny, I'm being kind of, for school, you get the traditional sort of Keynesian, kind of theories of economics, very math and model heavy, which I think is very useful and good. I'm not like a strict Austrian, but on my own time, I was studying Mises and those guys, and I think there's a lot of valuable insights there. So long story short, I got sucked down the libertarian rabbit hole. I realized there's a lot of good thinkers here, like good substantial thinkers like Nozick and Rothbard and stuff like that. And I would say I became a pretty staunch libertarian for a good amount of time, and this kind of corresponded with my other kind of philosophical commitments. For me, for a while, which would have been atheism. And as I kind of crept my way out of atheism and became a theist, I started to assume other metaphysical and philosophical positions I didn't previously, which then began to kind of impinge back on some of my libertarian commitments, right? Especially things of how we think about rights, how we think about political authority. So I think that's probably where our last conversation picked up.
Yeah.
Was I'm still a wayfarer in my political commitment. So consider this conversation to be just halfway committal. Anything that I say, I'm still trying to work through exactly where I stand politically on a number of things. So yeah, I would say at this point, I would consider myself more of a common good conservative, who is still very much sympathetic with many libertarian lines of thinking.
Okay. Yeah, it seems to me like you're starting to go kind of back in the direction that I kind of came from. See, I grew up in a conservative Christian home that was basically all about, well, we vote for the Republicans. And I would say that they tended to have reasons for that. It wasn't like they would say that's just the way it is. They'd be happy to talk to you about it, and it was typically things like abortion and stuff like that. And I kind of started moving more toward libertarianism away from that when I was in college, shortly after I got out of the Army, because I was in the Army and was over in Kuwait and Iraq during Gulf War II and things like that. And basically my reason for it was more or less that I kind of saw the government doesn't tend to do all these things as well as we seem to think it does. And the more I looked at it, I realized, well, the Republicans want the government to do all these things. The Democrats want the government to do all these things. To some degree, they want it to do different things, but they both seem to think the government's the solution to the problem. And from what I saw most of the time, the government tends to seriously muck up most of the things it does. So why should I look to the government to solve problems then? And that kind of pushed me toward libertarianism, which I don't take it as strongly as I know a lot of other people do, but I think of it more as just use as your guiding principle. The government that governs least governs best. And people should, in as much as possible, be left free to do whatever they want, as long as you can't directly demonstrate that it hurts other people. So even though I have moral problems with a lot of things that people might do, there's a lot of ways that I think people can go hurt themselves that I don't think it's the government or greater society's business that they do. They should just be free to do that and then free to suffer the consequences.
So there's a kind of general line of thought there that I think, and a common good conservative is in many ways different than like a mainstream American Republican. I mean, we could hit on some of those differences as we move along, right? But certainly, the idea that, whatever the level of government involvement is, there is, I think, a general commitment to let's keep it on the lesser side in a number of respects, especially in areas where we can promote individual initiative. And if anything, the government, from a common good perspective, conservative perspective, would say that we should promote individual initiative as much as we can. And we want to do that because that will be for the common good. But the government may very well have a place to come in and correct abuses at certain points. So I think that might be a shared commitment, but with a specific point of departure of just when we think the state or the government might want to come in and correct certain abuses. Now, it's funny you brought up and this I'm sure will come up more in the conversation, is abortion. And this was something that gave me a lot of trouble as a libertarian, despite my, starting very liberal and not being religious. There was always something to me that just seemed so utterly wrong about abortion. This was something that I just always seemed on its face gravely immoral to me. And when I would read certain libertarians on the abortion issue, this was always one of those problems that I did not think libertarians had a very good response to. I mean, some would just bite the bullet, like even Rothbard, and just say, well, it's a parasite. He would sometimes use that language, which I think was just really philosophically sloppy and showed some potentially serious negative moral implications of some aspects of libertarian philosophy, right? So the abortion issue was one that really never sat well with me as a libertarian, because I had this deep, just call it a moral seeming at the time, even if I didn't work it out, fully back then. I just always had this deep moral seeming that whatever else, we want to say about the legality of it, it always just seemed like an intrinsic evil to me. So that's something I actually struggled with for a long time, even as a libertarian.
I certainly agree with you there, because at least there are some situations, I think, where you can point to and say, well, an abortion in this case is not good, but it might be the only option we have available, or the least of all evils. But that's not the case with 99.9% of abortion. And there I mean examples like where a pregnant woman has cancer, and if you don't treat the cancer, she's probably going to die before she gives birth, but if you start treating the cancer, it's going to kill the baby. Well, what do you do? Well, that's a very hard question, and maybe you could argue an abortion's better there, but it's clearly not a good thing, and it's 99.9% of abortions aren't like that.
Right, and I would say that's substantively different. Like, same thing with like an ectopic pregnancy, and that's where, at least in natural law and Catholic moral philosophy, we have, the doctrine of double effect.
Yep.
And there's, a very big difference between, going in and intentionally killing an innocent human versus intentionally attempting to save another, innocent human's life, even with foreseen negative consequences, right?
Yeah.
So a good philosophy of ethics, I think, can handle those situations, and it would still rule abortion out as intrinsically immoral. We would just have to make those somewhat subtle but important distinctions.
Yeah. My wife is actually a practicing OBGYN, and from what she tells me on this, the medical community doesn't even look at things like ectopic pregnancies as abortions, because they're like, well, there's nothing else you could do. What are you supposed? You just leave it there. The baby's going to die in most cases by the time they find out about it. The baby's already dead. And if you leave it there, the mother's going to die. You've got to do something. So they don't even look at that as an abortion.
And the idea is, in a lot of these situations, that if we could save the baby, we absolutely would.
Absolutely,
right?
Yeah. I've quizzed her about that, and she says, well, there just isn't technology that could enable you to save the life of a child in an ectopic pregnancy. Maybe a couple hundred years from now, medical tech will advance to the point where you could do something about that. But there just isn't a possible way that we could do that now.
Right, absolutely. So yeah, we're on the same page there. I think that once you work out some of those quote unquote hard cases, you'll see that something like for me, traditional natural law can handle that. We can make the distinctions with double effect, that we can still firmly say that abortion is intrinsically evil, which again mapped right on with my intuitions, even before I was religious, even before I was a conservative. Right, it was just always something that smacked me about that, of saying, yeah, okay, I maybe I can't articulate it at this point, but that's just something that, especially in libertarian philosophy, when I read people like Rothbard, and I would say so much of him, it makes sense, but then we'd get to these sort of tougher moral questions, and he would want to bite I think a pretty unacceptable bullet on that, and that was undermining for me in a number of ways, at least and I want to be careful here, when we talk about libertarianism, that itself is a spectrum, right? We have right, we have anarcho-capitalists, we have anarcho-syndicalists, and we have a whole bunch in between. So I don't want to lump all libertarians, in the same category, because that's certainly not the case.
Oh yeah, there are some who are far, far more libertarian, capital L's, than I am. There are some people who are much closer to common good conservative on that than I am. I call myself like a libertarian with a small L, because that's probably the closest just descriptor you'll get to what my political beliefs are, but I depart from many of them on many things. And typically, whoever the libertarian candidate is, with a few exceptions, I tend to depart from them, because unfortunately the Libertarian Party tends to nominate crazy and deeply unserious people all the time. So,
yeah, what's going on with that? I mean, especially in recent years.
Yeah.
But no, you bring up a couple of good points. I'd be curious to hear more of your thoughts on it too, because I mean, for some of the deeper commitments of libertarian philosophy, of people who would say there's no proper grounding of political authority, take somebody like Michael Huemer, right? And I think his book on political authority is very helpful, because it does show a very deep inadequacy of so many secular models for political authority, but they can't get authority off the ground, really. At least not in the way that it would seem to map on with most people's intuitions, that political authority does seem to have some type of legitimacy, that it might be a natural kind. But that's not a problem if you're a theist and you come from a natural law perspective. Same thing with taxation. I was that freshman in college who would say taxation is theft, right? and thought I was really making a good point with it. And now I totally don't think that anymore, right? I think that there's a very legitimate basis in taxation that flows from the state being a sort of natural society, if you will, just like the family is a natural society. So in an analogous way, in the sense that I have a legitimate authority, even to compel certain of my family members, my children, the state has something similar, something analogous in its organization of the common good as well, which can certainly merit and ground taxation. So that's something where what I used to believe, I no longer believe. But that doesn't totally remove me from my libertarian friends, because, again, if we're just talking about ideas like, should we keep the government mostly out of people's lives? Well, yeah, I'm probably still in substantial agreement with you there, right?
Yeah,
it's just
that's mostly where I am. I'd say, just as a general rule, if you for the government to do things, I think it should meet a very, very, very high standard of proof to be justified in coming in to do things. Like, essentially, the government should be the last resort possible. Like, if you're having trouble with like a certain company that cheated you, like they sold you a defective product or something, I think there should be numerous other things that come into play before the government finally steps in and says, okay, we're regulating this company because they did a bad thing. They broke contract law. They broke a good faith agreement between you and them as a consumer, that kind of thing. Because from what I've seen in the research I've done, my time in the military, other things, the vast majority of the time when the government steps in, at least when our government steps in, it mucks it up and causes all kinds of bad, unforeseen consequences all over the place. Like, I did an essay on this a couple of years ago about how the government... It's not generally perceived this way, but the U.S. government has spent more money and resources trying to lift people out of poverty than, to my knowledge, any other government in history. We spent more money on public aid programs than we spent on all of our major wars combined, which, again, you listen to the media, you wouldn't suspect that, but that's the way it is. But it hasn't really worked. In fact, arguably, it's caused more problems. I did the research on this a while ago. There was as of 2016, we'd spent over $20 trillion on public aid programs, and the poverty rate stayed more or less the same. So I don't really trust the government to get involved with things unless it absolutely has to. It just doesn't seem to work very well.
Right, and that's something. And I want to be clear, because and here's maybe a mark of, a demarcation between common good conservatives versus a lot of, I guess, mainstream American conservatives or Republicans. And it's this idea of kind of the public welfare or government spending. In principle, a common good conservative can not only be for public spending, but could be for, a quite robust amount of public spending. But they may have, in the order of prudence, significant reservations about doing so in certain areas, right? And especially to the points that you're making, Phil, here, I think this is a good example, or even education, right? So people might, I know we're going to get into Trump and Biden here at some point, but you might just, sometimes people will claim, well, how could you vote for Trump? He seems to be against education, and Biden wants to invest more in education. Well, when I look at the investments in education, the outcomes that have been going on in America, to be as charitable as I can about it, I would say I'm not impressed, right? Yeah, to be as charitable as I can about it. So it does seem something like school choice. Now, maybe I'm wrong about that, but that's something that people in good faith could disagree about, right? There's nothing intrinsically evil about disagreeing about something like that. Whereas I think there is something intrinsically evil and quite black and white when it comes to abortion, for example. So, and I know we're going to get into all this later on, but the point I want to make is I no longer have any in principle problem with public spending. But I may have reservations that are quite in line with libertarian sympathies still, just on the order of prudence and outcomes, really empirically based reservations at this point. And I think that's how a lot of social and economic issues are. And unfortunately, people aren't willing to look into that. I mean, same thing with minimum wage, right? Is like you can run the kind of thought experiments of to kind of, as Austrians will typically do, of why maybe a minimum wage might not be a great idea. But as somebody like Brian Kaplan says, who himself is an anarcho-capitalist, admits, is if you can't imagine at least one scenario where a minimum wage might actually have a positive impact, then you just don't have a very good imagination, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So, a lot of these questions to me are empirical questions, right? We have to look at, well, what has it actually done in certain areas? What are the effects? And there's a lot of opaqueness. There's just a lot of areas where people of good faith could have substantial disagreements on something a minimum wage. I mean, we could agree, as I think we all should agree, that we should take care of the poor. We should take care of the vulnerable.
In general,
but
that's
we could have
society should do or try to do. Yes.
Right. Yeah. Certainly, it's a commitment of a common good conservative. I've never met anybody who disagrees with that, despite the caricatures. Like, show me the person out there who says that we should just that we shouldn't do that. I've never met this person. Honestly, they don't exist as far as I can tell. But so the point I want to make is that people in good faith could agree in principle on something, but they might have very substantial disagreements on the best way to achieve that, the specific means for it. So yeah, I don't know where I'm going with that, but it just came up in my mind when you brought up the idea of the welfare state. Like, yes, I care about the public welfare, but I would probably disagree with a large number of ways that I would argue many of the liberal and democratic policies have tried to go about it, which seem to have been, again, at best, not very impressive, but I think in many instances often producing more harm than good.
Yeah, I agree. I wrote a whole essay about that I gave at the Society for Pentecostal Studies about 3 years ago now, and got some significant pushback because I was going after some people's sacred cow there. But yeah, I come to politics with the perspective that there, like you said, there are certain moral considerations that are black and white. Like a society that says, no, we're not going to make any effort to take care of our poor and downtrodden. That's wrong. That's evil. But beyond that, my greatest concern is we need to look at what practically works. Like sometimes I know people will like to point to, well, this government over in Europe does things this way. And I usually want to say, well, that's not our government. Just because their government figured out how to make it work doesn't mean our government could figure out how to make it work. I want to look at politics as much as I can through a practical lens of, well, what's going to work? Just because you've got a good idea and you've got good moral intentions behind it doesn't mean it's something our government is going to actually be able to do. And I wish more people looked at politics kind of that way, because I usually see a lot more, for lack of a better term, moral posturing, where they're saying things along the lines of, well, if you pay a tax rate that low, that's immoral. Or if you pay a tax rate that high, that's immoral. And I'm kind of like, well, no, a tax rate isn't moral or immoral in and of itself. I mean, come on.
Yeah. I mean, you make a great point. Whereas the move is something like this. It's a very classic rhetorical move, and I think it's worth exposing. Is that if you don't agree with me on this means to an end, you must object morally to that end. Mm-hmm, and since you don't agree with me on this means to alleviating poverty, you must want poverty, right? And that's obviously just a very cheap low blow, but it's used all the time. No, we disagree on the means. That's it. Like we both want to get rid of poverty. We both want to get as many people, affordable health care as possible. Of course, we want to educate the public. Like, of course, we agree on these ends. And I think we should celebrate how much we actually agree on the number of ends. That's something we should really come together around. But what's lacking is a substantive, sincere conversation on where we disagree about those means. So I'm glad you brought that up, Phil, because I think that is something that's worth pointing out, and it has poisoned political conversation to no end.
Yeah, it's very often that the arguments basically dissolve into the other side disagrees with me, therefore they must be evil. When the vast majority of the time, that's not the case. I think there are cases like you bring up with abortion where it's very difficult to see how you can look and say the other side is not morally wrong. But for the vast majority of the other issues that go on in our country, like people talking about healthcare sans abortion, it's not moral or immoral whether you get your healthcare from a government bureaucracy or from a completely private entity. It's just what works better.
Right. And I want to even give the benefit of the doubt on the abortion thing. Like, yes, I think if you are pro-choice, you are supporting something that is gravely immoral. I don't think there's any way around that. However, I don't think people are pro-choice because they want to kill babies, right?
Exactly, yeah.
Not most of them, right?
Yeah. Certainly not the majority of them. Yeah.
Right. What I would argue is that there's a sort of moral fog going on, or they're focusing on one set of moral facts, which are important and are worth recognizing, at the expense of more significant moral facts. So they're considering things that are otherwise good, like privacy and property and women's rights. However, it's what they're not considering that is the issue, right? Which is, of course, the innocent human life, right? Exactly. And that's fundamental, right? So the right to life is if we have rights at all, that's surely the bedrock right. And in as much as that privacy or property have any function. It's really an instrumental function. It's something that derives its value from the inherent dignity of human beings. So to try and use those rights to override the more fundamental right is just completely perverted. Like that makes absolutely no sense.
Yep.
But what I'm trying to do here is say I don't think everybody that's pro-choice is like an evil person outright. I think I couldn't even imagine that be. I don't think that could be the case. I think they're just not seeing the issue clearly. But at the end of the day, I think it's gravely immoral, just like slavery is gravely immoral. But look, there was people who didn't see that issue clearly either. And there's a lot of great research on motivated reasoning out there of why we suffer these cognitive blind spots, these moral blind spots. And the kind of funny thing is we look back at other societies and cultures, and we ask ourselves, well, how did they not see this? Like, how did they not see the evil of slavery or anything else that they did or other cultures do now? But we often don't want to reflect on our own culture and ask ourselves, is there anything like that we might be morally blind to right now? And I would argue, yes, there is, right? It's abortion, right? This is our contemporary defining moral issue that hopefully, I pray, sooner rather than later, we'll look back with as much disgust and shame as slavery once we finally abolished it. But that is a moral blind spot for many people.
I couldn't agree with you more. And we should probably bring that up again later when we talk about whether or not it's practically useful to be a single issue voter, because I know for so many conservative people or Republican affiliated people, they pride themselves on being a single issue voter with regards to abortion. And I'm kind of skeptical of that, but at the same time, I feel the pull of that, because that you're talking about literally murdering babies by ripping their bodies apart. That's not something that should be taken lightly, at the very least.
Right. Yeah. So we can talk about that now, or we could bracket it for later. But it's worth hitting at some point. Mm-hmm.
Well, why don't we bring it up now, since it just came up organically? Because that is something that so many people talk about all the time. That is, you can never vote for somebody who doesn't hold the same position on abortion as I do. Full stop.
Right. Right. Yeah. And
I was just going to lay this out. I can as I said, I can understand that practically because, well, here's an example I had. I wrote something put up on Facebook back when it was Trump and Clinton running for president, arguing you should vote for neither of them, and was criticizing in there people who make these single issue voter arguments, saying you can do that, but you need to do it a lot more carefully than most of you are doing. And here's a good example. If you know for a fact that one of the two candidates is going to start a nuclear war, like they literally say in a debate, when I become president, the first thing I'm going to do is launch all of our missiles at Russia. Mm-hmm. Well, it doesn't matter what else is said at that point. You should absolutely not vote for that person. No question whatsoever. So I think you can, logically speaking, be a single issue voter, but I think with abortion, it's a little more difficult because it's not as though the president can sign an executive order saying no more abortions. It's not as though he can directly do things. It's not the same thing as him saying, I'm going to launch all my missiles at Russia.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So a few thoughts on this. One is, I think that certain issues can assume such a significant degree of moral priority that they can legitimate a single issue vote. And I think people get this, right? Like if slavery was on the table right now, I think most people in our contemporary culture would realize, okay, even if I agree with the other candidates' policies on taxation and healthcare and education, if he's pro-slavery and the other guy's like anti-slavery, I got to go with the anti-slavery,
I would think so too. Yeah.
This has such a moral priority and is such a significant undermining of just the fundamental moral fabric, right, of society as a whole. That whatever else my preferences may be, whatever else I think other good policies may be, and that may very well have other moral import. I don't want to deny the moral significance of other issues. This one is so severe, it's so significant that it is not just a single issue, it is a defining issue, right? And I want to say, obviously, the same thing about the right to life, right? Mm-hmm. So slavery, grave moral evil as it is, abortion is trouncing all over the most fundamental right that we have among the most innocent and the most vulnerable in society. I mean, the babies in the womb, right? Oh, so yeah. I think that unless you have something that raises to a significant morally calamitous situation that does very well can legitimate a single issue vote. Now it's just hard to imagine what that would be. Like, it would have to be something like, well, maybe you just have another pro-abortion candidate, right? You just have two pro-abortion candidates, but one of them happens to be pro-abortion and pro-slavery, and the other one's just pro-abortion. Well, then you could, if you're going to vote at all. So we'll bracket off the question about not voting. Let's just say you decided you are going to vote. Then you could vote for the pro-choice, pro-abortion candidate, but only under the intention of limiting the greater evil, right? So you're not doing it because they're pro-choice, but because you see this as the only means to avert some greater evil.
So I think same thing. Two evils, essentially.
Right, but with the intention to thwart the greater evil, and intention, and again, this is actually kind of another double effect question, right? So you can be morally permitted in doing that, so long as you have the right intention there. Now, we can also talk later about not voting at all, which may be a very legitimate choice as well. But same thing here. Like, you might, let's just give the hypothetical that you disagree with everything about the pro-life candidate on education, healthcare, taxation. I would still argue that the right to life issue is so significant, and one candidate being clearly pro-life, at least far more significantly pro-life than many other pro-life candidates we've had in recent years. And I'm talking about Trump, of course. And one candidate not only being pro-choice, but I mean, like, really just following along on the progressive, the radical agenda up to infanticide, right?
Yeah, he is.
So I think, if you just want my short answer, I think it's a no-brainer. I think it's a no-brainer that this could legitimate a single issue vote. And then, of course, if we dial down into details, I wouldn't even concede the other points. I don't think Trump is worse on other issues. But even if he were, right, I don't think there's anything else on the table that even raises, even close to the level of moral significance as abortion. That even if you hated everything else about Trump, including his personality and Twitter account, I think it would show great moral maturity and insight to just swallow hard and say there's such a fantastic evil on the other side that I have to do whatever I can to fight this.
Yeah,
and that is your intention.
Oh, there are good reasons to hate President Trump's Twitter account, of course. So
right. So yeah, that's I guess my short response about that. I think it is such a grave evil that it could legitimate.
I really like the way you did that, because you did something that most people who I see talk about this don't do, which is you said, I need to look at the whole of both the candidates and try and evaluate it as best as I can. And if when I look at the whole, abortion outweighs or seems to outweigh all the other things, then I'm going to be a single issue voter over abortion. But you started with or at least in the process said, I'm trying to look at the whole and make sure that abortion really is outweighing all the other things there. And most of the people who I hear saying, I've got to vote for the Republicans because of abortion, they don't even attempt to do that. They don't even consider, well, what if there's all these other things? What if all these other factors can outweigh that? And I think that's what you have to do to be essentially a single issue voter. Is you've got to start by looking at all the issues, all the candidates as a whole, and only then, after you've done that, can you then, I think, be reasonable and justified to say, well, abortion's the tipping point, because you did the hard work of looking at everything involved. And that's more my criticism for people who are single issue voters, is I don't think most of them actually do that in the way you just did.
Yeah, and I think you're right. I think you have to roll up your sleeves here and just do the homework, which you should always do no matter what, right? And I guess the other thing I would say is that, maybe somebody would say, well, look at Trump on immigration or the poor, but I would say those issues are just nowhere near as black and white and clear to me. In fact, I think many of Trump's policies are better for the poor than many of the liberal policies, on the order of prudence, on the order of just the empirical data that we have. So that's something, again, where I think people of good faith can disagree. But the abortion issue isn't like that, right? It's not. It is. Some things in life really are just pretty black and white. Now, there's an objection coming, and I know what it is. I've heard it a million times, right? And it will be, well, look, under, and I'll try not to use the annoying voice here. I want to be charitable, but, well, look, under, certain liberal presidents, we see the abortion rate going down. So see, wouldn't it be better to get a pro-abortion candidate in there? And let me just cut that objection off of the legs. And let's run a parallel example here, right? Imagine that slavery were still in place, and you had one candidate that says this is a horrible evil and it needs to be eradicated from the face of the earth. And you have another candidate that says, well, look, yeah, he's pro-slavery, but as it happens when pro-slavery candidates are in power, fewer people own slaves. It goes down 5 to 10%. What person would take that argument seriously, right? But you shouldn't. Some things are so evil, some things are so wicked that they deserve our full attention for their swift and complete eradication right now, immediately. Slavery is one of those things. Abortion is one of those things. They're so evil that itself would be wicked to want it just like an incomplete and somewhat gradual reduction of it. I mean, that's ridiculous. If you think that's ridiculous with slavery, you should think it's equally ridiculous with abortion. And one of the things we look back at with somewhat shame of our political leaders of the past, like Washington, and I'm certainly not one of those people that thinks that we should think poorly of people in certain contexts that just didn't see things clearly. I mean, that's all of us, right?
Yeah.
But we look at Washington, and it seems like towards the end of his life, he recognized that slavery was a wicked practice, but he seemed like he didn't want to really do anything about it because he was afraid that it would disrupt the Union. And you know what? He was right. He was right that it would disrupt. Yeah. Exactly. But we look back and we say, you know what? He made the wrong call. This was so evil. He should have just fought it anyways. And he should have done it, of course, not with the intention to disrupt the Union, but the intention to obliterate this evil from the face of the earth. And I think that's the kind of conviction and courage we need to have with the abortion issue as well.
Yeah, and I would also say to that the people who say that haven't really done their research, because what correlates far, far better with reduction in abortion rates is not who's president, but how things are going economically. When economically people are doing well, the number of abortions goes down. And I forget which book it was in, but there was the feminist philosopher Carol Gilligan did a study one time on why women have abortions, where she interviewed a couple of women who'd had abortions. And with one exception, all of them said, because I didn't feel like I had any other choice. And the exception, even Carol Gilligan said this exception was crazy. We shouldn't listen to her. And so that tells me, well, that what most women, the reason they have abortions is not because they want to. It's because they don't feel like they have another choice. And when your economic policies are good, it's easier to be a single mother than not. Like, I think it's never easy to be a single mother, but it's easier now than it was 40 years ago. So yeah, anyhow, that's abortions actually just tend to go down due to factors, I think, that are, not terribly related to who's actually in political office. And so I guess that would be my only comeback for abortion being the issue is when you look at how the U.S. government actually works, the president doesn't more or less have a lot of power. I mean, there's some things he can do. It's not like he has no power there, but it's not like you get the most, for lack of a better term, fanatical pro-life president in office. Suddenly abortion's going to end.
Right. And that's a good point. It's a realistic point. And we have to remember that so much of this is cultural as well. I'm not a political determinist. I don't think all politics is downstream of culture. In fact, I think it often works the other way. I think culture can influence politics, and politics absolutely influences culture with the laws. So definitely. 100%. So I also want to acknowledge, and this is important, that there's many things that when I talk to my liberal friends that we actually agree on. There's many other conditions that I would like to see reduced or eliminated that might put a woman in a situation considering abortion. I mean, just issues ranging from lack of virtue and in terms of sexual behavior to fatherless homes, deadbeat dads. And there's policies that I really do not support. I think they're bad policies like no-fault divorce. I think there should be strong incentives for healthy family units given by the state. I think there should be strong punishments for abuses within the family unit, abandonment, fatherhood abandonment, stuff like that. So I just want to say I acknowledge all that stuff. Now, the fact that those kind of unfortunate conditions are at play does not excuse abortion. And I want to be clear about that. It never excuses an intrinsically moral evil. But for me, it's not an either or. We get rid of abortion and we try to make a more morally cohesive and sustainable social order that hopefully that, women won't find themselves in situations where abortion is even being considered. So it's not a neither or for me, I guess is the point I'm trying to make.
You view it as kind of a both and, like pursue it from the political end, but also pursue it from more these social ends, like giving social and cultural support to women who are single mothers so that they don't feel like they have to get abortions, supporting crisis pregnancy centers, those kind of things, as well as voting for pro-life candidates then.
Right. I mean, so one of the definitions of the common good, right, is just, quote, the sum total of social conditions which allow people, either as groups or individuals, to reach their fulfillment more fully and more easily, which would include a healthy family unit, right?
Yeah.
So when I talk about the common good, all those things would certainly be in consideration. So yes, definitely a both and. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Well, I think we've kind of done that topic, so why don't we move on? Actually, I think this relates to another point I'd put in our notes, that I also do think, and you can feel free to disagree with me if you like, that most people, we tend to vastly overestimate the power of our votes, at least at the federal level. Now, this isn't the case in your local elections. It's not the case, at least to the same degree, in your state elections. But when it comes to, say, your vote for president and my vote for president, doesn't actually carry near as a whole lot of weight. Like, I'm in Missouri. I can tell you with about as much certainty as I can say anything, President Trump's going to win Missouri in the next election. He's probably going to win it by between 5 and 10 percentage points. So is my vote for or against him in the presidential election really going to carry much weight? Probably not. And for most people, at least with the presidential election, it does seem to be that case. Like, you've probably read them as well, but I've read philosophers arguing the actual amount of power your vote wields, at least in national elections, is so low that you're basically wasting your time even talking about it. It's just
right.
Or I like to say it another little bit more positive way. I have more effect on the results of the election by having this conversation with you,
correct,
and putting it out to other people than I do by actually voting.
Right. So let me say that I acknowledge that argument. It's forceful, right? Because it is true. Statistically, your one vote is it's insignificant, 100%. I don't think there's any way to escape that. So at the very least, I think people need to realize it's a both and, right? If you want to make a difference, you need to participate in the conversation. You need to participate in the culture. You need to participate in contributing to the common good in as many other ways as you possibly can. So if the only thing that you're doing, the only time you discuss politics, the only time you think you're going to contribute to the political climate is in the presidential election, I think that's when that sort of libertarian retort kicks in with a lot of force, right? Like, yeah, buddy, you're not really going to make any difference at all. Now, I don't want to say people shouldn't go vote because, like you said, these conversations can make a difference. So let's exaggerate it a bit. I mean, we're not celebrities, but there's a reason that politicians often like to get celebrity endorsements, right? Because if they can convince, say 15,000 people to go out and vote, my understanding, if I remember rightly, is like it was somewhere around 12 or 13,000 people that won the election for Trump in Michigan. That's not a big margin.
No, that's
right?
Extremely small. Yeah.
Extremely small. And I don't think it's unreasonable to think that we might see similar margins in this upcoming election. So just from a practical standpoint of being on a public platform, I want to tell people to go vote, right? Even though I would acknowledge that on the individual level, yeah, it's your one vote is not. It's like adding one more grain of sand into onto the beach. It's just it's not saying it's nothing. It's obviously something, but it's not going to sway the election one way or another.
Yeah.
But again, speaking publicly, I don't want to say don't go vote because of that, because I don't know how many people this will reach, right?
Exactly.
Imagine it reached 100,000 people and 15,000 people. I mean, this is not realistic, but give an example, right? 15,000 of those people are convinced by my arguments on abortion that they go out and vote in Michigan. Well, that could make a difference, right?
Yeah, it absolutely could. I've heard and read many things that, like, last time around, since so many people thought Hillary Clinton was going to win, it was just a done deal. A lot of people who would have voted for her stayed home, and consequently, Trump won. And I don't know for sure that that's the way it went down, but seems pretty plausible. So
Right, absolutely. So I think we can recognize the truth of it on one level, but not also be bothered by it when having, like a conversation like this, a
yeah,
public conversation.
voting has an odd dynamic where the whole is more than the sum of its parts, because the group of voters has properties that the individual voter does not, to make very technical philosophical speak of it. So
Right.
and of course, that's, as I tell people all the time, that's absolutely not true in your local elections. Your vote holds substantial power if you're like voting for your local alderman, or the
Exactly.
town I'm in probably has 15 or 20,000 people. My vote carries a lot more weight here when I'm voting for local issues than it does in presidential elections. So at the very least, I should be voting in the local election. And ironically, a lot of the people who are all about politics know tons of stuff about national politics, but almost nothing about their local level, where their vote carries more weight.
It is bizarre. It is ironic, isn't it? So I just want to agree with what you're saying and encourage people. If you're not involved in the local politics, please, please pay attention. Right? It does matter. Of course, it doesn't, have as much. A local politician doesn't have as much, power as the president. That's obvious, but it does make a difference. These local elections. So if you're going to participate in the national elections, at least make it a both and, participate locally, engage in the conversation, engage the culture. 100%.
That's a far more rational use of your time. Far more, practical use of your time would be a better way to say that. Okay.
Well, and that's why I like having these conversations, because I realize when I go to the voting booth, my one vote, probably, the chances of that determining the election are just, astronomically, unfathomably slim, right? But who knows what a conversation like this will do? Who knows?
Somehow or other, my phone number got on several poll companies that will call and ask for my opinions. Like, do I favor this candidate or this one? What things have I heard in the media and things like that? And my wife asks me, why do you waste 20 minutes of your time talking to these people? And I say to her, because odds are I'm having more of an effect by answering these poll questions than I am by actually voting.
Right. Yeah, that's true. I do the same thing, by the way.
Yeah, although some of them do get kind of annoying, and I will freely admit that at times I try to gauge which side's polling me, and I stagger my answers accordingly if I can figure it out. So.
Yeah, I also get the text messages from how they got my phone of just campaign staffers and stuff like that. Yeah. So that's fun to sometimes get into.
Do you send them messages back messing with them? Like I've seen people put up on Facebook and things like that doing that.
I actually try to engage them most of the time substantively. And then what I found is usually 3 to 4 text messages in, they just say, thanks for your time and peace out.
Yeah, because they're not interested in substantive engagement. They're just trying to push people out to the polls and stuff like that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So I don't know if that is a futile effort of mine or not, but I make the attempt.
Okay. So I want to just move on to the next topic. When this is one that is very near and dear to me, and I try and convince more and more people of this, but so far I've been unsuccessful. But hey, maybe if this gets out to, like you were saying, 100,000 people, it'll make a difference this time.
Right, yeah, this is it. We're going to go viral, Phil. We're going to change the world.
Yeah. And that's that I see this as one of the biggest problems in American government today, is that the Democrats and Republicans have a monopoly on politics right now. There are other parties, but I mean, the Libertarian candidate last time around didn't even get 10% of the vote, and there was no better time for a third party to step in than when it was.
And of course they put up Gary Johnson. Of course they put that guy up. Like, come on.
At least he'd been the governor of a state for 8 years before that, but he's weird. He's weird.
He's super weird, and he's weak. He's one of those libertarians that just is not very robust.
Exactly. Yeah.
It would have been a great time for Ron Paul. Like if Ron Paul were in the. But anyway, sorry, don't want to make it sidetracked.
Yeah. And I guess the main reason I see this as a problem is, I think as far as their political philosophy, the Democrats and the Republicans aren't very much different. Although they'll scream up and down that they are, they both view the government as, we need to use the government to fix pretty much all the problems we see. Now, their approach can be a little bit different, and maybe like the Democrats want to step in on this issue where the Republicans don't, and vice versa. But for the most part, they just keep a stranglehold on politics and keep any other voices out. And I view that as a problem for a whole host of reasons, but the main one is I think that pretty much with any human system, and government is certainly a human system, you need to have some type of a force that pushes back, because otherwise we go too far. That's one of the reasons why it's very, very good for a person to get married, because if I lived alone my whole life, I'd retreat into my eccentricities and, probably not be as good a person, where now that I'm married, my wife pushes back and says, no, Phil, even though you want to, it's not a good idea for you to stay up till 1:30 in the morning playing games and having a drink. That's not good for you. But if I live alone, there's nobody there to say that to me. And even though I know that, I'm probably still going to do it anyway, because it is fun.
Right.
But now that my wife's there, she pushes back at me. And I view, in some senses at least, government as kind of the same thing. The Democrats and Republicans don't have anybody pushing back at them. And when you dig into it, you can actually see that in some senses, they've rigged the system to make it even harder for anybody to push back at them. And so they have all their excesses coming out, and nobody's pushing back at them. And coupled with that, and they've also convinced everybody that every election is an existential crisis. The wrong person wins, everybody's going to die.
Right. And
like I heard that all the time about Donald Trump last time around. If he gets elected, we're going to go back to having racist policies, and all the gay people are going to lose their rights. Well,
women will be in cages,
exactly,
and all that, right? And that was like, let me say that, right? So
none of that's happened. He's even appointed gay people as ambassadors, for goodness sakes.
So just a brief aside, my wife, she's staying home now and she homeschools now. But when Trump was being elected, she worked at I probably should have mentioned the company specifically. I won't mention any names, but when Trump won, people stayed home from work because they were legit, and they came in crying like the next day, thinking it was only a matter of time. Women think it was only a matter of time till they were literally in cages. And at some point you just have to, whatever your disagreements with Trump, you just got to question the propaganda machines. And you got to say, like, this is just not a healthy, like, there's serious considerations in politics. Don't get me wrong.
Absolutely. Yeah.
But there are levels of paranoia that are beyond, certainly beyond reason, but clearly are some form of delusion. And you saw that a lot. And I don't want to say like it's just on the liberal side. I think conservatives and Republicans can be like that too.
When Obama got elected, I was going to college at an evangelical college, and I heard the same things from people then. And I was talking to my dad about this last week, and I said, I don't like a lot of the things President Obama did, but I didn't lose my rights when he was president.
I didn't feel the need to go like arm up,
Exactly. Yeah.
And build a bunker in my basement. Right.
Yeah. It isn't like I lost the right to bear arms, the right to free speech, or things like that under President Obama. Now, he did a lot of other things I don't like, but I still have the same basic rights as an American citizen I did then. And gay people and women still have the same basic rights as an American citizen now as they did when before President Trump got elected.
I want to say one thing, here that I think is related, because people will say, when a criticism from the left of Trump is this idea that Trump's divisive and he plays on fear. But that's, that cuts both ways. Right? All politicians play on fear, and all politics is inherently divisive. So to me, that's just not a legitimate criticism. The thing you have to ask is, are any of these fears legitimate, right? And are any of these issues worth dividing over? It's just not enough to say, well, look at somebody playing to fear. I mean, the left plays to fear all the time. You're playing to fear by saying that Donald Trump plays to fear. That is fear that people have.
Oh, yeah. Go back and look at some of the campaigns in like the 50s and 60s when we were so worried about the Cold War. There were literally campaign ads saying if this guy gets elected and there'd be a nuclear explosion, implying Russia's going to nuke us all if you elect this guy.
Right. And so you just have to look, you have to get past the superficiality of it all. Now, you bring up the kind of monopoly of the D's and R's, and I think that's right. But I also think that the people have realized this. And I think Trump is something of a result of people being kind of sick of this. Like he is a disruption. There's no doubt. Like there's a reason that you have this never Trump camp within the mainstream Republican Party, right? They don't like Trump in the same way that the Democrats didn't like Bernie. The only difference is the Democrats succeeded at keeping Bernie out, where the Republicans failed at keeping Trump out. That's really the only difference, right? But it was the result of people being severely disenfranchised, and I think realizing what you're talking about, that they were sick of this sort of lock that these two parties had, where it seems like, okay, even if they say they're different in principle, I mean, like at the end of the day, you kind of compare policies between like Bush and Obama, or at least what got enacted. I mean, come on, like it really wasn't that different at the end of the day.
No, not on a lot of things. Yeah. In fact, I heard somebody say this one time. They said that they wish President Trump was better at speaking carefully and in a bit more of a serious way, because having somebody who's an outsider come in to the presidency and then be like, well, why are we doing things this way, could actually be a very, very good thing, because it forces could, at least in theory, force a lot of those old institutions that have been doing things the same way for 50 or 60 years to justify themselves. Now, practically speaking, it doesn't work that way, because even if that's what President Trump has in mind, he speaks in such an uncareful and often unserious way that that's not what comes out. But in theory, that could be a very good thing, because, you know, maybe there was a good reason you did things that way 60 years ago, but that might not be the case now.
Yeah. I think that that's a legitimate criticism. One of the criticisms I've always had. It's a hard criticism of Trump, because on one level you want your statesmen to be statesmen. You want them to be virtuous. You want them to speak well. You want them to be articulate. But then you look at our culture, and you know we're living in something very close to how Plato saw democracy. Which, if you know your Plato, you know that's not a good thing.
Oh,
right?
No, definitely not.
And you know. So on one level, you want to say, yeah, when Trump says indecorous things, I say, no, we don't want anybody talking like that. Mm-hmm. Of course, all politicians are liars, as far as I can tell. The big ones on the big playing forum. Certainly, we could compare like checklists of lies, but they're between the R's and the D's, but they're both going to be enormously extensive. So I don't think that's I don't think that's an apt comparison. I mean, Alistair McIntyre said he wished, that we had a rule in politics where if a politician lies once, they get like a red dot tattooed on their forehead. If they lie twice, they're expelled. They can never be in the game again, right? So like you wish that was our society, right? You wish that we had something like that, but it's not. And one can't really, I think, separate the sort of, I don't know, New York crassness of Trump from the fact that that gave him populist appeal. And that's why that's in large part why, because he didn't have that sort of affected, polished appearance that people, I think, are so sick of seeing in politicians, because they realize it's just a very thin veneer. Yeah. So whatever else you want to say about Trump, he at least he seemed to strike people as being somewhat more authentic, in virtue of him being somewhat more crude. Now, I'm not saying that's a good thing. I'm just trying to give an analysis of why I think it worked in his favor.
Well, you're certainly right there. I heard somebody say it kind of like this, that he says, well, I guess the American people decided they want the off-the-cuff, brash, and somewhat foolish lies of Trump over the very calculated, cunning lies of Clinton. Which,
you know what? And I'm somewhat sympathetic to that, honestly.
Yeah.
Right. Just because your lies are well spoken and articulate doesn't mean they're any less deceitful.
Yeah. If you've got a choice between two people who lies, do you want the one where you can probably tell almost all the time when they're lying, or the one that's going to put one over on you a couple of times? Well, there you go.
100, yeah, absolutely. So, yeah, I don't think you're going to get, like, if you're trying to decide between candidates, between who's the liar and who's not the liar, I mean, good luck. You're just not going to find one.
Yeah, Joe Biden's been lying up and down the whole time in his campaign now, making up stories that are quite clearly not true when you check them out. And
he's always been a liar. He's and from what you can tell, a plagiarist too. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, give me a break. Whatever else you want to say about Joe Biden, him having a history of unblemished truthfulness is just not the case.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and same thing with President Trump. The only distinction there is, I think most of the time we all know when President Trump is lying. I think he even knows when he's lying most of the time. So.
Right, because you know why? Because Trump is a marketer. Exactly, that's how you have to understand Trump. He knows all these, the person who understood Trump really well leading up to the next election was Scott Adams, because he understands marketing and persuasion. Mm-hmm. So he's like, well, look, what world did Trump come up in? It wasn't the political world. It was the world of marketing and business and persuasion. So he uses certain techniques of things being like directionally true. This is a persuasion technique. And the idea here is he exaggerates greatly to make something stick in your memory, but he does it in a way that it's directionally true, meaning it's in the direction that people recognize there's truth that way more than the other way. But its exaggeration makes him stand out more than other candidates. And the idea would be something like the wall, right? Whereas other people are talking about kind of subtle. So the directional truth is that there's a problem with our immigration policies. That's the directional truth. The exaggeration is that we need to build a big, beautiful wall, right?
And get Mexico to pay for it.
Now, the funny thing is he's actually sort of done that. So, like, the one thing that you think, like, Trump was just like, no way is he ever going to do it. He's somewhat, at least somewhat, he delivered more than I thought he would, if I'm being frank, right? But the thing is that sticks in people's minds in a way that just talking about, you know, the subtleties of immigration policy doesn't. And he gets that. He understands the power of imagery and directionally true exaggerations when it comes to marketing and persuasion.
Yeah.
And that's why and that's why, like, you have to understand, if you want to get Trump, which I think a lot of people on the left just don't, you have to know where Trump is coming from. So they can't seem to make up their mind of whether he's just like this incompetent buffoon or this evil genius, but he can't be both. Right?
Exactly. Yeah. You can't be an evil genius and an incompetent buffoon at the same time. And
right.
clearly
And
somebody who's been successful in as many venues as Trump has been, like in real estate, business, and TV, is not a buffoon. I mean, he has to have some level of intelligence to be successful, and to be successful in multiple fields.
And I want to admit that, you know, of course, the Democrat policies either. Like, you know, Joe Biden. I think he's wrong on a lot of things, but, like, you can't be a complete idiot and have that long of a successful career. Same thing with Obama.
Yeah, exactly.
I think he's wrong on a lot of things, but you can't be a complete idiot.
Oh yeah, I think President Obama was a fiercely intelligent guy. I think he was just very, very wrong on a lot of policies. But I wouldn't be surprised if he's one of the more intelligent presidents we've had in recent times. From the way he talks and the way he carries himself, he strikes me as an exceptionally intelligent man.
And there's a distinction to be drawn, you know, for any politician, and I think this is an important distinction between cleverness and wisdom. We see a lot of cleverness in politics. Unfortunately, we don't see that much wisdom.
Very true. Very true. Okay. Now, I have we're really eating up some time here. This is too good of a conversation.
I know, this is fun, man. I'm enjoying it. Well, we could make it a multiple parter if we need.
Maybe we should do that. Let's just keep going and see how it goes. So, what do you then think about the idea that third-party votes are throwing away your vote? Like I mentioned before, back in 2016, I wrote a note on Facebook and was telling people, don't vote for Trump or Clinton. Try and find a way to vote for neither of them and make your displeasure known, because I said at the time, I think they're both so far beyond the pale that you're justified in not voting for either of them. But at the same time, if you're going to do that, you need to find a way to basically send a message to the powers that be. How dare you nominate these two people? So at the time, I voted for Gary Johnson, who, as we both talked about, is weird, but I thought he's probably not going to do near as bad a job as Trump or Clinton is, because at least he somewhat agrees with me philosophically in that he's a libertarian. He did run a state for 8 years, and it didn't seem to be an absolute disaster based on what I could tell from what people said. So I said, here's the way I'm going to register my displeasure with them. I'm going to vote for the libertarian candidate. And then I told people, if you can find other ways to register your displeasure, that's fine. I couldn't think of what they would be at the time, but what I said is, don't vote for either of them. So I hear when I say these things, like I considered voting for the Libertarian candidate again until recently due to some stuff she said, but people would often tell me, you're just throwing your vote away. That's a de facto vote for one of the main candidates. And I've always found that to be, at best, exceptionally weak and flat out wrong, because if I vote for Joe Jorgensen, the Libertarian candidate, I'm not voting for Biden or for Trump. I'm voting for Joe Jorgensen. Now, you can argue about whether or not that very, very limited amount of power I have in the presidential election, whether I directed it well or whether that was a wise choice of my time. But I didn't vote for Trump or Clinton by doing that. At least I certainly don't see it that way, even though lots of people try to tell me that.
Yeah, I agree, right? So I think the force from the original argument of your vote just not carrying that much weight would carry over and kind of override that claim as well. And so, yeah, well, how do I think about this, right? So Yeah, as you put in our little show notes document, McIntyre has a quote, and I love McIntyre. He's one of my favorite political philosophers.
Yeah.
And he says, when offered a choice between two politically intolerable alternatives, it is important to choose neither. I guess I would just say I don't see that as being the case right now. I don't think Trump is politically intolerable. I just don't. I don't see him as being a grave somebody who promotes a grave moral evil like abortion or something like that. Maybe people think he's politically impalatable. Maybe he thinks he's wrong. Maybe he thinks he could be better. I don't see him as being politically intolerable. Now, just so I think you could, and it's also, arguable that even if you we kind of ran that thought experiment before, imagine you do have two pro-abortion candidates and one is pro-abortion plus pro-slavery or anti-religious liberty. You could, in principle, be morally permitted to vote for one, with the intention of eliminating the greater evil of the other. But just because you could be permitted to do that without incurring moral guilt doesn't mean that you have to, right?
Just and it's one of the, something doesn't mean you should.
Yeah, it doesn't mean you should. It doesn't mean that you must. So I think that's an honest consideration. And it's one of those things where, especially since your vote probably won't really carry any weight, it's hard to see how you could have a moral obligation to do something that ultimately makes no difference, if that makes sense. Maybe somebody's got an argument to the contrary there, but that strikes me as probably correct. I think...
Oh, go ahead. I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No, I don't have much more to say. I would say, being completely indifferent is bad too. So if you're not gonna vote, what are you gonna do, right? And I think we've listed some other ways too. Because I do think, here's what I would say. I do think we all have an obligation to contribute to the common good, right? I think that flows from our nature. Yeah. So how you're going to do that, is important, and we can have that conversation. It's a different conversation. Does that mandate that you vote in a national level election? Without having thought about this too much, I want to say probably not. Yeah. I don't see the connections there. I could be wrong. I may take that back, but my intuition would say, no, you're not absolved from contributing to the common good, fighting for the common good, if you will, on some level. But yeah, so yeah, that's probably all my initial thoughts on that.
Yeah. The odds of it carrying over to, the odds of you making a difference in the national election are so remote that it just doesn't seem to apply to there. Okay. Yeah. What I was going to say is typically, from what I've understood, people who've been making that argument if you just vote for Jurgensen, it's a vote for Biden, or vice versa, or something like that, is they're just kind of assuming that I was going to vote for Trump and then decided not to, so that's support that Trump didn't get, or something along those lines. I don't think we should have politicians be able to take our support for granted. So.
Yeah, right. No, I agree. And so I would just say, so I did vote for Trump in 2016, somewhat hesitatingly. I also predicted he was going to win, and I'm predicting he's going to win again.
I think you're probably right. There's signs pointing in that direction. So,
well, all the signs that were there for me in 2016 are there even more visibly now. And all the models, all but one of the models, I should say, that had it right, that I looked at by political scientists in 2016 are also predicting Trump again in 2020, such as primary model and stuff like that. Models that have a very good track record, not these mainstream polls, which of course were looking very bad for Trump before as well. So yeah, my prediction is Trump is going to win. My hesitation, of course, was I was unsure. It seemed like Trump were saying some things that I could get behind that made him seem like a more endorsable candidate than Hillary. Again, I think it's pretty clear where my positions are, so people can connect the dots. Yeah. But now actually seeing his track record and saying, oh wow, Trump actually has done more than I expected him to. A lot of my criticisms would be I just wish he would have gotten more done. But we also can't expect, as you said before, Phil, the president is not just a single monarchical ruler, right? He's not a king. Our system by design moves very, very slowly.
Yeah, exactly.
But
yeah.
I mean,
anything,
with
the president has too much power, even with the power he does have now.
Well, I agree, right? Yeah. But even most recently, with the nomination of Amy Barrett, this is something that I wholly support. I think it is a wonderful nomination. I think he has actually made great political and cultural progress on one of the issues I care most about, which is the pro-life issue. And whereas the third party candidate, the Libertarian one, seems to actually be pro-choice, right? So like,
that's
for me,
yeah.
for me, even considering the third party candidate, Trump seems better than that at this point. So whereas
I agree with you
So whereas maybe if a third party candidate, say from like the Solidarity Party, were on the ticket or something like that, who's policy by policy I might agree with more than Trump. That just isn't the case for this upcoming election. I think just around the board, Trump is the better candidate.
Yeah, and from what I've heard about it, I very much like the idea of the Solidarity Party. I think something like that really needs to get off the ground and get some traction, at least in principle. I really, really like that idea. But now that doesn't. I don't think it's necessary. I think it's probably coming too late in this election cycle to make a substantial difference. But hopefully,
correct.
I hope they get a lot more traction and can really do some stuff in the next cycles, because we really, really, really need another substantial force coming in against the D's and R's. We really desperately need that. And if it can be that,
I agree.
Yeah.
And I would encourage people to check out the Solidarity Party. And this is a good opportunity to look again at local elections.
Exactly.
And how can I support this party in a more immediate way? So I bring them up for a reason, because if there was a Solidarity Party candidate, there. It's difficult to think about on a national election for various reasons.
But maybe a local
certainly,
election or something, yeah.
Yeah, 100%. Mm-hmm.
Okay, and I was going to say, as I told you, I didn't vote for Trump last time around, but my reasons were because he was saying all these crazy things in the primaries. Like, he literally said in one of the debates, I remember arguing with people about this, that we should have our soldiers go to the families of terrorists and kill them, which is committing a war crime. And when he was challenged on that, he didn't back down. He said, the soldiers will obey me. And I said to people, I was a soldier. That's a war crime. Not only is it a war crime, but soldiers aren't going to follow that. If he gives that order, he's going to find guns pointed at him, and he's going to be arrested. But he didn't do that when he was actually president. And now I'm started to realize he hasn't really done a lot of those very crazy sounding things that he said he would do in the primaries and in the debates and things like that, which makes him, at least in my mind now, much more palatable than he was then, because he didn't do that.
And I want to agree. That's why I said hesitatingly before, because of course, there was many things that Trump said that I felt a little uncomfortable with, again, to say the least about it. But then when push comes to shove, when it actually comes to policy implementation and procedure, he's been way better on foreign policy than Obama.
Oh yeah, he's gotten peace deals between Israel and UAE, and I think I forget the name of the Bahrain and at least one other country. Some stuff in like Macedonia, or maybe it was Kosovo. I forget. The kind of stuff that people were saying for 30 years would never happen, and
he's
somehow
doing
he made it happen. And he's doing deflated tensions with North Korea too, which it's wonderful. I'd rather we not be at war with people. So.
Right, and these are things that, again, for me, say, okay, where I was hesitant before, now I'm actually quite impressed. Right, these are things that everybody should be celebrating, and this, to me, a lot of these things are kind of tests of, what they call it, TDS, Trump derangement syndrome, right? And there's two camps that seem to have some type of cognitive issue going on. There's the one camp that no matter what Trump does, it's always bad, right? Where they can't celebrate things that are just obviously good, right? Obviously good. Like some of these peace deals. And there's the other camp, right, that thinks that everything Trump does must be good as well. Right? Exactly. Yeah. There's something wrong with both of these camps.
Yeah, exactly. Right? It's okay for me to say it's a good thing that Trump obliterated ISIS and did all these peace deals. And he also shouldn't go around on Twitter saying that, what's the name of the MSNBC guy, Joe Scarborough, implying that he committed a murder. That's wrong.
Right.
Nobody should do that, much less the president. But it's still good that he did these peace deals.
Yeah. Or even just, other things. Like, I don't like indecorous language. Like, critique your political opponents. You don't have to call women fat or something like that, I don't like any of that at all. Now, does that outweigh the abortion issue? Yeah, right. Not even close, right? But it's something that I think people should legitimately criticize Trump for. Now, again, it's hard to separate that because there's a lot of people out there, for better or worse, that see him as this guy who's willing to quote unquote punch back. And a lot of conservatives are attracted to that because I think the conservatives, rightfully so, in America have kind of been somewhat of pushovers, right? somewhat of pushovers. They've just taken it again and again and again on huge issues that are of moral significance. Now, what I would wish is that we could find a balance here where we can stand up, we can be courageous, but we don't have to resort to low blows either. So I don't know. Social media is annoying. But you're right, Phil, that anybody who can't either praise Trump for anything or anybody who can't criticize Trump for anything, there's something weird going on there. It's not good.
Yeah. You should be able to, at least in theory, say there's some good there, there's some bad there. And you should be able to say that about pretty much anybody who's been president, because we've never had, I can think of maybe one or two exceptions, we've never had a president in America who was far more of a bad guy than a good guy. At least with maybe one exception, I'm thinking of Woodrow Wilson, who from all the data I'm aware of, was a really, really bad guy. But other than that, it's not like they were throwing people in cages and acting like Hitler or something like that. No U.S. president has done stuff like that.
Yeah, I would say on the whole, there's certainly presidents where their policies are things I would say, that's largely a negative. But thankfully again, by design, our system has enough constraints on it that it's kind of hard for any one president to completely ruin the country,
Yeah, exactly. And that kind of goes back to that thing I was mentioning earlier, that both sides have convinced their base and many people that every election's an existential crisis, and that just never. I think part of what has been the blessing of the American system for so long is that it never really has been. That it doesn't matter if your side loses the election, you're not going to lose your fundamental rights, until at least not for a long time. My wife and I were watching one of the narco shows on Netflix a while back. This was the Mexico one about the rise of the Mexican cartels. Well, one of the ways the first drug lord who started the cartels got things going is he was bribing government officials left and right. So when the election came around and it looked like the party he'd been bribing was out of power, he had to help them steal the election, because it really was an existential crisis where if they lost the election, he'd lose his business and go to jail because he'd been bribing them. And I looked at my wife afterwards and said, that's what the two parties have convinced a lot of people is it's like every time. And it's not. And it pretty much never has been that way in our country, at least not the majority of the time. And that's one of the great things about the American system. Your rights don't live or die depending on who's elected. At least they shouldn't.
Yeah. So, how do I feel about that? Yeah, generally agree. At the same time, I think having revisited, Plato and the Republic, I think there is something kind of wrong with our culture right now. In terms of we seem to be creeping from oligarchy to democracy, as Plato would talk about it. Where am I? In terms of optimism or pessimistic? Say Trump loses. Am I packing my family up and moving out of the country? Absolutely not. Right. Do I think that I need to bunker in my basement if Trump loses, or that, my Catholic parish is going to be shut down? No, I don't think that. Do I think it would be bad on the whole for religious liberty? Yeah, I think so. I think if the left is the one way, I think we would see a degradation, but I don't see a collapse happening, right? And I think that's probably the best way to approach it. That we would see a movement and a degradation, but I don't think the immediate panic would be warranted. Now, I still think that's worth fighting against on many levels. But to your point about every election is an existential crisis, I agree. It just isn't, right?
Exactly, yeah. And that is one of the things that I like about Trump is he's willing to say no to the radical left. He issued an order a while back that there's not going to be any more government training sessions based on critical race theory. And I'm like, great. That should have been happening so long ago. And you see Joe Biden and the Democrats and the political left there not willing to say no to their extreme counterparts on the left, the people who will say, you're a racist who can never not be a racist, and absolutely crazy things along those lines. And they're just not saying no to them, which I'm kind of baffled, because why wouldn't you say no to those?
They're not only saying no to them, they're actively promoting.
Yeah, exactly. In many cases. And you don't hear that directly from Biden's mouth, but it's not like he's saying no to it either. And you could look at the people who he's surrounded himself with. They're all seem to be very much pro that direction.
I agree. Yeah, or the only time that they'll condemn any aspect of it is when it seems to show up in the polls with the riots, right? Which is very, of course, unprincipled. Whereas at least Trump was from the start condemning of these. And when I saw, his movement against the critical race theory, I celebrated that because it shows me something. I mean, it's a pernicious philosophy. There's no doubt about it. And it shows me impressively that Trump or somebody who advises Trump knows what the root of the issue is for a lot of these social problems right now. And that's a good thing, right? That's good. Yeah. So that's a good Trump moment right there, for sure. And if people aren't familiar with critical theory, you just got to do your homework there. It's an outgrowth of Marxist ideology. It's the whole intersectionality charts, redefinitions of racism. It's just instead of class-based struggles, now it's just gender or sex-based struggles pitting people against each other.
Yeah, and I was actually planning on voting for the Libertarian candidate again until I found out that she's bought into all that stuff too. And unfortunately, when I found out about that, and then I wrote her campaign an email saying, "I want to vote for you if you'll disavow this extreme left, this critical race theory, intersectionality, and this nonsense. I will vote for you." Because standing up to the extreme left that's trying to burn down things right now is very, very important. Once people are willing to... I have this general idea that there's lots of times people have legitimate grievances in life, but as soon as you start attacking people who have nothing to do with your grievances, legitimate or otherwise, you lose all your moral credibility. So,
100%.
In talking to people who buy into that, I'll say, okay, suppose I give you that there is all this systematic racism, there is all this oppression. Why then are they responding by going and looting Targets and burning down buildings that are owned by other minorities? That doesn't solve the problem. It'd be one thing if they were only attacking, say, government places or something like that, where I probably would still say they're wrong, but at least then they're trying to target their violence against the people that they think are oppressing them, where they're not even doing that, so they've lost all moral credibility at that point.
Yeah, I would say a few things to that. First is that I just don't grant the assumption. There's been studies on this, on disparities in police shootings, and what we find is it's just not true, right? We had we had the Michigan State study, we had the Harvard study on all this. The guy who published the Harvard study said it was the most surprising find of his life when he realized that it didn't match up with the narrative, right? So I would say two things from that, and this might trigger some people, but whatever. One is that we don't find the basis for, systemic racism in fatal police shootings. In fact, the evidence seems to tilt somewhat in the other direction, right? But if you want to talk about systemic racism, right, and by that we mean sort of generational effects of racism, where an institution could be set up in the past, maybe founded upon some bigoted perspective or principles that has now produced disparities here and now, right? This is sort of the idea of systemic racism. Exhibit A, my friend, is Planned Parenthood, right? If you want a quantifiable, measurable example of systemic racism right now, you keep pointing to police shootings. It's not there. It's not there. The best data we have on that says this is your hypothesis is false. It's not there. But you're ignoring the biggest thing that would actually support your case, which is Planned Parenthood. Now, we could argue whether Sanger was racist or not, but she was definitely bigoted. She was definitely an ableist, and she was definitely a classist. And in terms of disparities, we know that abortion disproportionately affects minority and Black communities. But the reason they don't want to talk about it is because it's against their narrative. So what they do in typical Marxist fashion is they just want to apply their narrative, one, where the data isn't there to support it, but against positions of authority and structural power. So there's a reason that it's being put on the police, right? Yeah. So I just don't even grant the first step, and nobody should, because it's not true. It's not true that police are just going around hunting down people because of their skin color. And we've seen as the facts have come out about these cases that there's so many lies. There's just so many lies. So it just agitates me.
Yeah, there's a couple of lawyers who I listen to talk about various news on YouTube. One guy's named Viva Fry, the other guy's Robert Barnes, and they do a podcast. And Robert Barnes says he's done civil rights cases forever. And what he says is Black Lives Matter never picks the cases where there's real obvious racism that would unite people. He said, I have cases where a pregnant woman was thrown in a closet at a police place for 3 days, and then 3 days later there's a dead baby and her in there. Black Lives Matter is nowhere to be found. They picked the cases
Right.
where the criminal was the guy with a criminal history who was doing something sketchy, was shot by police, and then they lie about it, and then when other facts come out, then juries don't believe them anymore. And so he says, my civil rights cases are being set back 20 or 30 years by this organization because when I get a jury, they're saying, I don't believe you, even if you've got video evidence, because I know these other cases I was lied to.
It's the boy who cried wolf, gone crazy, which is a damn shame, because racism obviously still does exist. Nobody's denying that. In a country of all these millions of people, you're going to have individual racists. Of course you are, and everybody should condemn that. And they should be dealt with. I mean, I just saw a headline the other day of a man who was convicted, rightfully so, of a hate crime and sentenced to 25 years in prison. Good.
Yeah, exactly.
Good. Great. That's what we want for somebody who legitimately commits a hate crime or a racist act like that. But if you're giving us this meta narrative, as we like to talk in critical theory, stuff like that we have this systemic issue of police just hunting down and shooting people because of their skin color, that's testable. Mm-hmm. We have data, and it's just false.
Yeah,
it's
just false.
Right.
The only issues places I would still say that there may be some places where you can find some evidence of systematic racism. Like I mentioned, my wife is a doctor. She says there's some evidence, some good, well-done studies in medicine that show that sometimes a woman from a minority, even when you adjust for like a income level and education level and things like that, doesn't receive the same care as a person who's not a minority. And I would look at that and go, well, that's definitely a problem. If that's really going on, we should find a way to address that. But that's also not what the people who are screaming about systematic racism are referring to. And furthermore, I think part of the reason is that would be a very hard thing to deal with. How do you even begin to address a problem like that? Because at least from the studies my wife has directed me to, it's not like the doctors or the med staff are racist and are treating these people poorly. And it's not like there isn't any one thing you can point to where it clearly goes wrong, and so it's a very difficult problem to deal with.
Right, and I think it's something where, if we're being honest, and we should always be honest, right? That like if there are these, truly racist issues, everybody should rally together and want to fight them. This is not something in principle that anybody should be against. But if you're promoting the defunding of the police and you're smearing cops as incurably racist, and they're getting beaten and killed because of this narrative, you're promoting an evil. You're really promoting an evil at that point. And then people are going to be less likely to believe you if you point out actual instances of racism. So it's doubly pernicious. And then things, and I want to grant that there are systemically racist issues. And I want to say, let's fight it together. Let's start with Planned Parenthood. But when I say that, suddenly I don't get any support on that one. It's weird.
All human systems are necessarily going to be imperfect, so there's always going to be things that go wrong and ways we can improve them. That's just the reality of us being finite human beings. So that's where I'm going to cut this off for now, and I'll put out the second part of Pat and I's discussion, the second day we had, next week. I know I'm putting this one out a week earlier. I'm typically now on a bi-weekly schedule instead of every week. But there's so much going on in politics, and since Pat and I had about 3 hours of material, I thought, I can just double down and put one out this week, one out, and then one out next week, so you will end up with at least 3 weeks in a row of podcasts. And then as far as what I'm going to do from there, well, we'll just see how long it takes me to get the next guest lined up and how long it takes me to talk to him and things along those lines. So, as always, like I asked you to, write in and let me know what you think. You can always reach me for any kind of comment at theexaminedlifewithphil@gmail.com, or you can send me a message or leave a comment at the Facebook page. Just do a search for The Examined Life with Phil. I've got back to updating that Facebook page now, so I hope to be posting interesting, funny, or relevant philosophical things on there from time to time, so check it out if you like. There is still some pretty good stuff on there from the other times I've posted on there. And as always, if you like what I'm doing on the podcast here, if you have good things to say about our political discussion here, share it on your social media and give me a like or a rating on whatever podcast app you use, whatever's appropriate. Get algorithms working for me so it can get out to more people. And if you don't like what I'm doing on the podcast, well, write in and let me know, or just stop listening and find something else to do with your life. So I will be back again in a week's time with the second part of Pat and I's discussion.
Hello, God's beloved. I'm Annabelle Mosley, author, professor of theology, and host of Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. I invite you to listen in and find inspiration along this sacred journey we're traveling together to make our lives a masterpiece and, with God's grace, become saints. Join me, Annabelle Mosley, for Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. God bless you. Remember, you're never alone. God is always with you.
To a production of WCAT Radio. Please join us in our mission of evangelization. And don't forget, love lifts up when knowledge takes flight.